For many years now, it seems like we've been engaged in a debate that questions and challenges the relative importance that we place on science in society and that which we place on arts. And the idea behind this session came about really from a feeling that there was a reflection of that arts versus science debate happening within the discipline of public and social innovation. So on the one hand, we see the rise of science-based approaches, that is, systematic experimentation, such as randomized control trials, which are seeking to understand how the world works, rigorously testing hypotheses in controlled environments. Now, the spectrum of that work is quite wide, but it has some shared common characteristics around systematic, being logical, paying a great deal of attention to data and a quest for empirical evidence. And then on the other hand, you have more design-based methods, and those are focused on creativity, origination, co-production, applying design principles and techniques such as creative ideation processes, prototyping and visualization. And those methods are not asking how does the world work, but what's needed to solve a problem, what doesn't exist yet that should exist, and how can we make that thing? Now, as innovation labs multiply across the world, so too do the adoption of these methods, and therefore it feels quite important, really, to apply a critical gaze. And when you look at these views and methods together, it raises a number of quite intriguing questions. So, where do good ideas really come from? What counts as evidence and what doesn't count as evidence? What counts as scientific? How do we judge the relative successes of these different methods when we're looking at sustained transformative innovation over just incremental change? And are we really looking at a suite of tools from which we can collectively pick and choose, depending on the context and the goal? Or do they really represent some very different underlying philosophies about the world and therefore differences about how to support innovation? Regardless of approach, are actually we still left with the perennial challenges of scale and diffusion, or does one method set the conditions more favourably for scale than the other? And if working in this, indeed working in any field, tells us that there's nothing as permanent as change, are these approaches that are in vogue today going to be the approaches that are in vogue tomorrow? And if not, what is it that stands on their shoulders, and to what extent can we predict and shape those methods ourselves through experimentation and through dialogue? So, to explore that and more, I hope, I'm joined by David Halpern and Christian Bason. Both David and Christian's work will be well known to you, I'm sure, as both have really advanced our understanding and knowledge of methods for supporting public and social innovation, and yet seemingly come from two quite different places. So David, founder and chief executive of the Behavioural Insights team that you heard about a little while ago, former chief analyst in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, founding director of the Institute for Government. Before entering government, David held tenure at Cambridge and at posts at Harvard and Cambridge, and he's the author of a number of books, including Social Capital and The Wealth of Nations. Christian Bason, Chief Executive of the Danish Design Centre, also an author of books and other extensive writings on the subject of design, innovation and management in the private and public sector. Many of you will know him, I'm sure, from his former role leading the Danish innovation agency MindLab, where for years he worked on developing and conveying design methods, both within Denmark and internationally. So as leaders in your fields, I wanted to thank you for coming here today. I want to ask each of you in turn to present some thoughts to us, and we will take it from there. So perhaps, Christian, you could join us first. Thank you.
Last December, I was doing a workshop for newly appointed directors in the European Union. And the title of the workshop, or the training session, was, I think, Innovation and Design. And when I came in the door, and there was a group of about 25 people, they looked at me and started laughing a little bit, and one of them said, "So, where's the chair? Where's the beautiful Scandinavian Danish design chair that you were supposed to bring for the session?" And I said, "Okay, I guess this is the starting point. Let's start to talk about what design actually is." And so I guess that's what we're going to be exploring a little bit this morning. So first of all, thanks for having me, and it's really amazing to see a lot of people that I've also worked with in various ways. It's like looking at a global and emerging and a community of labs. So it's really great to be here, just to say that. And also to say that One thing that Helen didn't mention is that my background is in political science, and that I worked for 10 years in a consultancy in Denmark, building a practice around evaluation, randomized control trials, performance management, and I also helped start up the first national evaluation society in Denmark. So why is it that I have then left public policy or performance management and evaluation and started to embrace design? What's up with that? And also, why have I now taken up the role as chief executive of the Danish Design Center, which has a mission to strengthen the use of design in business and in government, and to help professionalize the design profession in Denmark specifically. And I would say that why I've done that and why I'm so interested in design is because I've seen personally and also organizationally what it can do to transform public organizations and private organizations, and how it can change people's lives in ways that I have not seen a randomized control trial do. Or a beautiful 250-page evaluation, and I've done a lot of 250-page evaluations in my time. So just very briefly on what is design, because it was mentioned a few times already, and as you can imagine, I would say it's a little bit more than a chair, a beautiful chair. But design, of course, is about giving form. It's really the knowledge base about how do we give form, how do we create, you could also say, desirable futures. And just to say, one of the most famous designers of chairs, Charles Eames, and some of you might know him, Charles and Ray Eames, a couple that designed a lot of beautiful, beautiful chairs. Some of you may even own one, an Eames chair. He was once asked, what is design? And that's when you get really curious. What would a designer say to define his own profession or her own profession? And Charles Eames said the following: design is the process of arranging elements in such a way to achieve a particular purpose. Arranging elements in such a way to achieve a particular purpose. That was his definition of design. And so if you're a policymaker or a leader in government or in a social organization, and you think about your role in changing and transforming organizations, isn't that really about taking elements such as finance, services, processes, regulation, and rearranging those elements in ways that achieve a better purpose, a better intent, better outcomes for people, for society? So that is, I think, a very, very broad starting point for design. But what it really does say is that it's future-oriented. I would also say that design in many ways is about systematic creativity. And I tweeted earlier a blog I wrote about different dimensions of design. But you can say that certainly design is folded out between arts and science. So to give an example, in Denmark the other day I was at the commencement services for the Royal Danish Academy of Design and Architecture and Conservation. That's a very artistically oriented design education, and you can just by the way that the students dress, you can see that these are not really business people, and they may not even thrive too well in the business environment, I don't know. But they're very artistic, very sensitive, very concerned with how human beings experience surroundings. They're concerned with materials, with textile, with color, and are extremely skilled in working with materials to create particular expressions and particular futures. But on the other hand, in Denmark, we also have the Danish Technological University, the University of Science, where you have a design education called Design and Innovation, and where basically we produce engineers who are good at engineering design. And between those two spaces, you also have master's degrees in service design, and you have professionals who are working on how do you transform services, both physical and digital. So think about the processes of arranging elements, that those processes can deal with everything, from graphics to products to services and really to systems. And so what you're doing if you are in any way engaged with creating futures or creating some kind of change, you are actually engaging in design. The question is, are you any good at it? And so what is the value of design practice? And let me just say a few things also to sort of set up for David here in our little science versus art battle that's happening here. So first of all, I would say that design helps us with imagination, with discovery. So as Helen said, where do ideas come from? If you set up a randomized controlled trial between one set of part of the solution and another kind of solution, ideas have to come from somewhere. They don't come out of the blue. And designers and other creatives are really good at coming up with ideas in the first place. And also often the way you inspire to get new ideas is by conducting, for example, design research, ethnography, coming up close, doing qualitative observation studies, participant observation, to get ideas about what might be ideas and what might be solutions in a certain context. So that's first point. I have 4 points about what design can help with here. The second point is to give the form and the shape to the kinds of solutions we actually want to put into society. So when David's team is drawing up a new letter or a new text message or a new digital service, that's a design process. And how do you then shape and give form and color and structure to those artifacts, those physical things you put into the world? That's, of course, also where you need design. Thirdly, the holy grail of what all of you are working on is that word scaling, isn't it? Diffusion, growth, scale. How do we take small experiments and solutions to national scale or global scale? And I don't believe that scale can happen just through evidence. Telling people, this worked here, you should probably do the same here. In Denmark, on average, it takes 17 years for a proven medical procedure in healthcare, 17 years before it's scaled across the Danish healthcare system, even though it's evidence-based. And that's in a profession where you kill people if you don't do the right procedure. It's a profession where doctors and nurses are kind of engaged in trying to help people, and still it takes them 17 years to take on the best methods. So what does it take to go to scale? Well, what it takes to go to scale is that you yourself are part of the design process as a professional, as a social worker, as a nurse, as a teacher. There has to be an element of invention and creativity involved. It has to make sense to you in your context. So you need evidence, but you also need a creative process of understanding how that evidence could fit into your context, in your setting, in your organization. Finally, a final word on the fourth thing that design can do is to introduce something different than rational and logic and analytical in society and in for our citizens. What about magic? What about enchantment? What about experience? Public services are not about just what works. It's about how is it experienced to be a child in a school? How is it experienced to be a patient? How is it experienced to travel through a healthcare system? And that's empathy and a human understanding of what happens when we encounter public services is not fully rational. It's also very, very subjective, and that's what design can help us with. Final 30 seconds on 2 critiques of design, just to say that as a political scientist, of course, I'm not a designer, and there are things that designers are not that good at and you should be critical of. One is designers would tend to try to invent something new every time. But there is evidence out there. There are things that work out there. So of course designers should also be aware of what's already been done and what seems to work. And the second critique I would say is that as much as designers are skilled at empathizing with users and citizens, they're not always so good at empathizing with organizations or with bureaucracy. And that goes for business and public sector as well. So designers may need to develop their empathy skills a little bit with understanding and empathizing with systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian. David, would you like to
I was
take?
very tempted to wear a white coat today. I thought I should have really done that. But let me at least, what I thought I'd try and do is 3 things I was going to kind of to get across today. One is I want to talk about failures for a bit, which we don't talk enough about. Secondly, I was going to talk a bit about essentially where I do have quite a strong view, which is that with a kind of fashion for labs and it's cool and here's these kind of chemical structures and you can see a little beaker there, a glass beaker against GovLab, is that actually we've quite often lost the essence of what a lab is, which has got built into it experimentation. Really important. But the final thing, in fact, I was going to start with is I thought I'd talk about some organic chemistry. I thought it would be good for you to learn some today. But I should ask, how many of you do actually have a sort of harder science background? Oh, very good. Okay, lots of you. Very good. So you can correct me if I get this wrong. I'm a bit rusty on my old... I started life as a natural scientist because Cambridge. So I thought I'd start with a story from organic chemistry, which is about benzene, for those who don't know it. So benzene was benzene had been known about roughly, since 500 odd years. We didn't know exactly what it was. In fact, it was Faraday in 1825 who first, here in the UK, I should say, actually managed to isolate some pure form of it. But we didn't really know what it was. He didn't know what the formula was. And it was more than 40 years before a paper was published, actually by Goulden, suggesting what he thought the structure of benzene was. Don't know how many of you remember this from your school chemistry. But here we are. This is the formula you'll have learned when you're at school. Right? So it's got 6 carbons, 6 hydrogens. It's very simple, you might think. But it turns out it's really hard to figure out what does it actually look like? So Goulden published this paper in 1865 suggesting that in fact it was a ring. And he subsequently told the story about how did he come up with this idea. And so I'll tell you actually what the structure is, so you know. So little learning point. Here we go. It's like this. You'll now learn. You've got your carbons are all around in the ring, and they've all got a little hydrogen on them. Anyway, it's kind of obvious afterwards, it turns out, but it wasn't at all obvious at the time. And Goulden had the idea from a dream. He had a dream in which he saw this snake, and the snake bit its own tail. 1862. And anyway, it gave him the idea. He'd been working on it for 7 years, but that actually it might be a circular structure and that the carbon was wrapped around on itself. It actually took a long time. In fact, it wasn't until 1929 that it was finally confirmed that this was the structure of benzene. But the point about it, why I'm telling you the story, is that it was actually a very creative, crazy thing, that the idea he had this dream of a snake, and it turned out that he was right. It took a long time to figure out he was right. And so that's why a lot of us know the story, and if you don't know anything about organic chemistry, you might know this particular story. But he could have been wrong. Actually, he really could have been wrong, and quite often people were wrong, which is why I want to talk a bit about failures. So lots of things that people think are a good idea, whether they come up from a dream or wherever it is, where do ideas come from, they just very often turn out to be wrong. This is really important for us to remind ourselves, particularly since we are all subject to optimism bias, particularly about our own ideas, which always seem really good compared to everybody else's. So lots of ideas turn out to be wrong. So just an example close at hand. In fact, a year ago, I was reading in the Evening Standard, a London borough had got this fantastic idea. You'll recognise it as soon as I describe it. It was a big picture of a kid in handcuffs, and the question was, they were going to be taking school kids, and they were sticking them in the back of a police van and locking them up and taking them to a prison run, and it was going to show them that, you don't want to go down a life of crime. And in fact, there was a comment from, as it happens, a minister as well, saying this is a great idea. Great idea. It's such a great idea, of course, that lots of people have had this idea across the world lots and lots of times, such that, as we all know, Scared Straight can be delivered for a few dollars a time in the US. It's too bad that actually, in fact, almost exactly a year before this article in the Evening Standard, there had been a systematic review showing that Scared Straight makes kids more likely to offend by quite a big margin, by 60% odd. So this is true in lots and lots of areas. Lots of good ideas don't work. Really important for us to understand this. It's true in many areas. It's true in medicine. Of course, it's true in medicine. Sometimes the phrase is used by medics who say the parachute test. We shouldn't test parachutes systematically. Let's chuck 10 people out of a plane with and 10 without a parachute, and let's see what happens. And they use this sometimes to say, of course, you shouldn't do a trial on this particular medical technique because it's obvious that it works. It just turns out that actually quite often things which people convinced were effective, when we finally do a trial, it turns out they often were in fact killing people. And even in BIT, let me just share with you, we've had lots of things that didn't work. We've had lots of things that did work, and it's been a great success, but we have had examples of things that didn't work. I mean, a recent example we'll publish shortly is, it was a great idea, actually partly from lab-based work, funny enough, is that if we showed people pictures of their home in infrared, and you could see all the heat leaking out, you'd be much more likely to go and insulate your home. So we ran a trial, sending people letters, and it had a picture of homes, and we matched the home as closely as we could, and you could see all the heat leaking out. It made them much less likely, it turned out, to then go on and get insulation. So what's the point about this? Is that what we need to do is we need to marry the creative process, which of course has got a place, with systematic testing. We need to have that kind of humility about what we do. And we're trying to do that on an increasing scale, even not just about behavioural insights. So in the UK, we have the Educational Endowment Fund, run more than 90 large-scale studies in the last few years, 87 of which are randomised controlled trials involving more than 500,000 kids and 4,000 schools in the UK. And lots of things they've looked at have turned out not to be very effective. So it's really important that we do that in everything that we do. And I wanted to kind of share with you, so if you like, it's a dirty secret to come. One last diagram because actually, obviously, Christian and I are great friends and so on, and we believe that these things can be pulled together. But I'll just show you a mnemonic, which we sometimes use ourselves. So you all know the design diamond. Sometimes the double diamond, that whole creative flow. It's not quite as pretty as benzene, but it's, And we overlay on it a simple mnemonic, right? TEST. T, test. So what's it stand for? First of all, clarity. What is your target? What are you trying to answer? What's the question? Often we're not clear enough about that. And we also try and ask early on, what's your data? What's your measure? Right? What data is there? And if you ask it early on, it's really powerful. We then go into explore. Yes, be creative. Think about the solutions. Think about what the evidence is telling you. Fine, that's the upswing of the design diamond. And then we drive into what's the solutions? Prototyping, not so different. As you start to narrow down and but then finally we conclude with the T is trial. Run a trial. Figure out whether it's actually true. Did it work? So, I mean, that's kind of my main message. I mean, obviously, you'll gather I'm pretty ultra. I feel very strongly we do need to marry into innovative approaches this kind of systematic approach. And I'll just leave you one final physicist in order to conclude the slightly hamming it up on the, is Feynman, Richard Feynman. Fantastically creative scientist. He did quantum chromodynamics, for those people interested in what he actually did. But he also wrote lots of accessible books and about lots of subjects. And his main point that he would urge people, not only in the scientific community, but more generally, essentially, was to embrace humility. Embrace humility. That is the essence of the scientific method, is that constant self-doubt about, is it true what you're saying, right? And if we can do that, if we can marry that into our innovation approaches, I think we get something which is much more true to the original lab conception and actually is much more likely to be effective over time. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. I think, the idea of having a plurality of approaches is kind of core to what this session is about, although we're sort of pitting you against each other a little bit. I think there's clearly a deep appreciation of each other's work. I just wanted to ask you, Christian, whether you come back to that, because there are some criticisms of design not paying attention to the rigour of evaluation and testing. How do you approach it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, one issue is when you start on a design brief, many designers would just start by doing. And that concreteness and that specificity of saying, let's just do something, let's try something out, is of course a strength. But it's also the weakness that you don't start with a major desk research on what is the available evidence of best practices and what works. So I think there's something going maybe in parallel or at the same time as you begin to work on a brief to say, well, what do we actually know already? And then, of course, this exploration of context, because we know that this program didn't work in California or did work in California, who says it's going to work in Copenhagen? So I think and you could say that humility of a designer to say, well, somebody may have actually explored this before. I mean, no problems are entirely new somehow, you know. And I think the other one, which is clear in David's slightly boxy design model, is that once you arrive at a point where you have some options, and design is all about creating options for decision making, right? Then clearly there is a point where you would like to more systematically test and try out, maybe even at scale, to get statistically founded evidence of what seems to work. I would say that one important thing is that designers experiment all the time. The designerly way of arranging elements is not the analytical way, it is the experimental way, so which means it's prototyping, it's testing out, it's trying out what makes sense to users, it's throwing sketches and throwing models out and trying new ones. So I would say that inherently in the design process driven by professional designers, it is an extremely experimenting process and also a lot more messy than this beautiful linear model here. But just to say that I think there is a curiosity and experimentation, again, and where there's a possibility of a marriage, in a sense, between designers' way of working and the way of working more evidence-based.
And just before we go out and have some questions, because I'm sure there are lots in the audience, I had sort of a question about how you think about people in all of this. So it might be too simplistic, but it feels like your science-based methods are more about research on people, so at a distance, objective analysis of what's going on. And with the design methods, it feels like it's more like research with people, if we can call it that, sort of more cooperative inquiry, action research based. Now, that might be sort of too simplistic a kind of divergence, but I do wonder about how then that affects scaling of innovation, because it feels like you've got I don't think it's a matter of style. I think there's something quite fundamental that sits underneath all that. David, I don't know if you...
Well, in the behavioural insight work is definitely of course, by the way, yes, we do a lot of effectively kind of method acting approach to policy. Like if you're going to look at the energy markets, let's actually try and change supplier or whatever and see what it looks like and feels like before you talk to the PM about it. So we do a lot of that. We do a lot of spending time with people trying to understand a context. But you're right, there is a subtle difference, which it's not true for all lab-based work, but we spend a long time, of course, in the behavioural and the psychological literature, and it makes us a little bit more sceptical about what people say. So the accounts that they give about why they do things, we tend to be slightly distrustful for, which is one of the reasons why, of course, it drives us back to a strong form of empiricism. Because, you know, if you ask someone, if we wrote you a letter which said most people pay their tax on time, do you think it would affect your behaviour? They might well say no. They certainly will say, you know, do you think the plate size you eat off affects how much you eat? Many people say, of course not. And of course, it hugely affects how much you eat. So you only establish that through empirical observation. We in turn do think you have to marry it with some sense in you ask public permission about when you start to use these approaches. So there is a certain wariness we have, but I think it also, I hope, brings with it a deep sympathy and understanding of like people are phenomenally complicated and interesting sort of subject of study in their own right. So, yeah.
Sure.
So one thing that no one has mentioned yet this morning, but that's missing, is leadership. It's the role of the decision makers in government that ultimately make the decisions, whether it's child services, whether it's energy policy, whatever it is. And in my experience, and this is some of the also the doctoral research I've been doing over the last few years, is that the discovery at a very, very personal level, even an emotional level, as a leader, as a decision maker in government, of what is right to do, what should we be doing, the insight into policy programs that are miserably failing to address problems, to miserably failing to help families and people and so on, and understanding at a very, very personal, fine-grained level how we need to change. That's been missing from the conversation so far, and the only way that I can see that I've seen that happen is through insights. It's insights into what are we doing today, how might we change it, and then it is really supporting and facilitating a process, engaging people in discovery, where leaders and managers and their teams discover for themselves what they should be doing. And this is not a plug for my new book, which will be called Leading Public Design, 2016, Policy Press. But it is to say that there's a mission dimension, which is also a people dimension. We have to remember there are people making decisions every single day in government that have huge consequences, including PMs. Maybe not them so much, but the others have big consequences. And we have to remember that what we're dealing with here is influencing decision-making. Remember, everything we talk about today is ultimately about influencing decision-making about the allocation of resources in our societies. And we have to take a look at who are those decision-makers and then what are we doing to influence them. And it takes more than statistics and more than convincing numbers to convince people to change their behavior.
Great. Thank you, Christian. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask if there are any questions that we want to pose. Yes, if you want to say your organisation and your name.
Sure. So thank you very much. I'm Samir Doshi from USAID. And I had a question kind of trying to link up the humility factor with the discussion around evidence and evaluation. And normally, as you've discussed, the evidence is kind of goes to external accountability, but I'm wondering about internal accountability and how you would practice aspects of reflexivity in your ongoing processes. So to question whether an RCT is appropriate in the first place rather than just going to a narrative that's strongly established.
How and when do we pick?
It's really a question of how do we understand the world, isn't it? And what is a question of what is true. And what I've experienced personally and in my research is that leaders who see for themselves 3 or 4 examples, cases, rich examples of how citizens experience a process that they're responsible for as it fails, that's enough for them. That's truth enough for them. That's evidence enough for them to begin to change. They immediately start, in the experience of what's going on, to think about new ideas, new solutions. So I would say that that's in epistemology, it's a way of understanding the world or gaining knowledge about the world that's very, very powerful and transforming. And whether the other epistemology, the way of working with statistics and significance tests and so on, is sufficient to change the world, I'm not so sure. I would say if you want reflective, inquiring organizations and leaders, you definitely want the qualitative piece in there as well, at least.
And one final question for David, maybe.
Thank you very much. Chloe Sarovich from Teach First. Excuse my voice. Hopefully you can hear me. A question for David. So you talked about the importance of failure and recognising that things don't always go the way you'd intended, and I guess it links to accountability. So how do you instill a culture of kind of risk-taking and acceptance of failure in government and kind of decision-making levels, so that you are able to have that kind of testing approach to design that's needed to work out what works and what doesn't?
Yeah, so we spent quite a lot of time with my What Works hat on. The key issue often with departments, so if you start talking about what works and say, oh yeah, come and meet our analysts, like actually that's not really the concern. The primary focus is often the policymakers. It implies a different way of doing policy. Sometimes we call it radical incrementalism, which is the nerve to be able to say to a minister, actually, we don't know. Honestly, we don't really know. Christian's got some great ideas. There's 5 or 6 of them here, but we really don't know if any of them will work. But the good news is we can try it out. We don't have to go for a single solution. We can try multiple options and we can test and see. So there was a lot of discussion yesterday in the budget around the welfare reforms. If you talk to the relevant welfare minister, he'll say privately, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of decisions that are built into legislation on any given area. If you do a bit of math for a second, you say, look, 300 decisions to the power 2, even if you're going to get more than the atoms in the universe type thing. So you have no idea whether you're making the right choice. But the good thing is built into the legislation has been explicit power to experiment and test variations. And you do get resistance, and people say, is that ethical? Oh my God, you're going to do experiments. Like, well, how else will we ever know if something's so? Is it ethical to not find out? I just want to last comment, which is particularly, so you've got a very international group here. I think there's one, and Jeff and I have been talking a bit about this, one of the bits of apparatus that is built in the kind of traditional science areas. There's lots of institutional practices and platforms that are developed, and one of the things is to find out what did people already know on this before I stumbled into this area. And we're not very good in terms of our platforms to do that in relation to much policy. So as we build the What Works centres in the UK and in the US and elsewhere, there I think is a real need to create a much more cross-national platform where you can easily find out what did someone already know? Did someone already do this review? For us to collaborate and coordinate, at least on the ground-clearing evidence review work. I know Jim's here from the US and Bloomberg. I think they're playing a key role in the US. So I'd love that to be one of the things that comes out in this community, to make it easier for us to figure out what did and didn't work before would be an enormously valuable asset for us all to build.
Hugely valuable for everyone in this room, I think, and beyond. So we've scratched the surface, but our time is up, unfortunately. I want to thank David and Christian for showing us actually these are not particularly opposing methods, but actually huge amounts of complementarity and respect amongst it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.